Thank you so much. Okay, we start right away. It's about mind, brain, life, and the paradigm of embodiment. Much may be known to you, but I try to give an overview that helps us to, well, settle ourselves in the middle of the current debate. Of course, the main question that the embodiment paradigm starts from is the question: what constitutes a person? What constitutes a living being? And now we have the usual neurobiological paradigm as it is expressed, for example, by the neuroscientist Eagleman. Our thoughts and our dreams, our memories and experiences all arise from this strange neural material. Who we are is found within the intricate firing patterns of electrochemical impulses. So in this view, consciousness is a byproduct of the brain's information processing, which creates an inner model, a simulation of the world. That is also found in the following quotation of the German neurophilosopher Thomas Metzinger, whom you certainly know. Conscious experience is like a tunnel. Our brains generate a world simulation so perfect that we do not recognize it as an image in our minds. Then they generate an inner image of ourselves as a whole. We are not in direct contact with outside reality or with ourselves. We live our conscious lives in the ego tunnel. So are we, in fact, locked in the tunnel of a virtual model of the world produced by the brain? Certainly not, because if neuroscientists would all be enclosed in their own world model, then there could be no mutual understanding between them. There could be no agreement on their object of research. And this object, that means the brain, would be only a subjective illusion from which no valid knowledge could be gained. So such a view of the brain is epistemologically mistaken. But it is also insufficient on the level of cognitive functioning of the brain, for it completely ignores the body, the organism, and its interactions with the environment, and thus it ignores all the interrelations and cycles in which the brain is embedded, and which are constitutive for mental processes. So what I will propose instead is, of course, an embodied and extended view of mind and brain, according to which the mind is certainly not in the brain. It is not located in any one place at all. Rather, it is distributed among the brain, the body, and the environment. And the brain is certainly a central organ of conscious life, but it is only an organ and not the seat of the mind. It is a mediator and not a creator of conscious experience. So human subjectivity is embodied and not just embrained. That's what I want to follow, to develop in several steps. Mind-body divide, dual aspect theory as a kind of ontological framework. Then I go into the 4E cognition paradigm: embodied, enactive, embedded, and extended. And then if we have still time, I look at the circular causality of living systems that explains their holistic aspect and their holistic action. Now, cognitive neuroscience is still based on the principal divide between mental events and physical events, or between the subjective mind and the objective body, the one only accessible from within, from a first-person perspective, and the other accessible from without, from a third-person perspective. And thus the basis of the mind shrinks, so to speak, to the brain. The body is only a transducer of stimuli, a vehicle of the brain. And what is fundamentally missing here is, of course, the concept of the living organism or the living body. And thus mental states are directly connected with brain processes in a kind of short circuit of mind and brain, as it were. Interestingly, a German philosopher of the 19th century, Ludwig Feuerbach, has precisely pointed out what is missing here. namely Ludwig Feuerbach. I quote from his writings on this. It is neither the soul that thinks and senses, nor the brain, for the brain as such is a physiological abstraction, an organ cut out from the totality of the skull, the face, the body as a whole. The brain is only an organ of the mind as long as it is connected to a human head and a body. And in accordance with this view, my main thesis is that the mind is not confined within the head, but extends throughout the living body and includes the world beyond the skull. And in this sense, the brain becomes a far more modest mediator of human experience and not its creator. Now, instead of the still prevailing dualism of the physical and the mental, I propose an ontological concept in which the living being or the organism is the primary entity. And this living being can now be regarded under two aspects. On the one hand, from the left side, as a lived body, a subject body, or in German, the Leib. On the other hand, as a physical body, an object body, or Körper in German, including the brain, of course. The first aspect on the left corresponds to the first, but also to the second person perspective. So the body as the center of subjective and intersubjective experience. And the other aspect corresponds to the third person perspective of, for example, natural science, the body as a physical object. And thus the mind-body problem, in a sense, dissolves and turns into what may be called a body-body problem, lived body and object body. And so instead of a gap between two radically different ontologies, the mental and the physical, we are now dealing with a duality of aspects within embodiment. And they both have a common reference to the living being in the center, or in the case of human beings, a common reference to the person. The complementarity of the aspects can be compared with two sides of a coin, of which always only one becomes visible without the other. And they also correspond to two different perspectives or attitudes that we take towards a living being or towards a person. And it's quite interesting that on a daily basis, a doctor, for example, undergoes this change in aspects or attitudes. For instance, when greeting a patient like this person here and seeing his friendly smile and gaze, but then shortly afterwards, the doctor might start the investigation of the body and take hold of an ophthalmoscope to examine the patient's eyes as physical organs, looking at them closely with his instrument. And at this point, looking at them from too close a distance, we can already realize that the friendly gaze has vanished. And the doctor may even get closer and investigate the retina of the eye, just like a neuroscientist, for example, may explore now all the microstructures and microprocesses of the physical body, of the optical pathway projecting the optical nerve projecting into the occipital cortex, where he can investigate the neural columns, the neural networks that are necessary for a visual perception to occur. But nowhere will the doctor or the neuroscientist encounter consciousness, mind, or life. They won't show up any longer because they are macro phenomena that are only accessible in coexistence, only from the second person perspective. So a slight change of attitude, but nevertheless seeing quite different things, and both attitudes are nevertheless still directed to the same entity, to the living being or the person. So the lived body, the subjective body, is the organism itself under the aspect of its holistic aliveness that is manifested subjectively and intersubjectively. And in this sense, the second-person perspective reminds us that only the living being as a whole may be regarded as the proper subject of feeling, thinking, speaking, etc. So according to this paradigm, the mind is, of course, not in the brain, rather it is embodied in the holistic interaction of an organism with its environment. And this is what we will now look at in more detail: embodied, embodiment, and enactivism, or what may also be called an ecological view of the mind and the brain. The last 2 or 3 decades have seen the rise of this paradigm, and it is often now seen as the embodied inactive paradigm, first established by the groundbreaking book The Embodied Mind by Varela Thompson and Roche in 1991. And the term enactivism is derived from the word to enact, expressing a fundamental assumption of this approach, namely that mental processes are not passive occurrences, but they are dynamically and actively generated through the interactions of a living system with its environment. In other words, cognition and experience are basically action-oriented. We understand the world through our bodily engagements with it. And this is, of course, in contrast to the classic cognitivist paradigm, where cognition is seen as a manipulation of internal representations in the brain. Now, in this new paradigm, cognition and consciousness are no longer seen as internal models, but as the result of circular relationships between the brain, the whole organism, and the environment. And the function of the brain is not to construct mental representations of external objects, but to mediate possibilities for embodied action in the world. And thus, consciousness also becomes an overarching process that is not confined to the brain, but equally involves the body and the environment. Now, in recent years, the term 4E cognition has become established as a collective term for the various approaches to embodiment, encompassing 4 aspects or dimensions: embodied, extended, embedded, and enactive. And I will present these 4 closely interconnected dimensions in what follows. The embodiment, first, of the mental is the fundamental assumption of 4E cognition. So it assumes that the body is constitutively involved in all functions of consciousness, whether through the role of interoception for basic experiences of being alive, of emotions, of feelings, be it through sensory-motor interaction with the environment, or also in the bodily experiences and operations that are effective in linguistic and abstract thinking processes. So accordingly, the body is certainly not a container of the mind or a puppet controlled by the brain, but it is itself the primary player in the field of experience. This principle of embodiment can be illustrated by contrast to the functionalism of classical cognitive science. On this view, mental processes are regarded as similar to computer programs and thus understood as software. The same processes could in principle run on entirely different material substrates, and consciousness could be generated just as well by a sufficient complex AI system based on silicon diodes and transistors as it could run on a human brain based on carbon biochemistry. However, from an embodiment perspective, cognitive and conscious states can only be produced by a living organism, because consciousness primarily serves life processes. It is not a model of the world, but primarily a state of the whole organism in which its current homeostasis manifests itself. So that experience occurs is linked to the necessity of living beings to maintain an inner balance in exchange with the environment. And this is enabled through metabolism. Deviations from homeostasis must then be recognized in time in order to develop the adaptive and necessary behavior towards the environment. And to prevent the organism from perishing, of course, in this way. And in higher animals, this internal perception is enabled by basic life feelings that reflect the state of homeostasis in its ups and downs. So these are drives and their satisfaction, for example, hunger and thirst, general well-being or discomfort, pleasure and displeasure. So positive feelings indicate an increase in homeostasis. Negative feelings indicate its endangerment. So the maintenance of homeostasis and thus the viability of the organism is the primary function of consciousness, as manifested in instinct, hunger, thirst, pleasure or displeasure. Therefore, it doesn't originate in the cortex of the brain, but results from the ongoing vital regulatory processes that involve the entire organism and that are already integrated at the level of the brainstem and the diencephalon. So the brain and the peripheral organism are in a constant feedback relationship. And based on this, a bodily, effectively toned self-experience is formed. It includes the feeling of being alive with its various states of pleasure and displeasure, which I've already mentioned, and which underlies all higher mental functions. It corresponds thus to a basic or core self, and this can be also expressed in the following way. All experience is a form of life. Damasio points out that this basic feeling of being alive reflects the current state of the body along varied dimensions, for example, along the scale from pleasure to pain, and these feelings originate at the level of the brainstem rather than the cerebral cortex. All experience is a form of life. As I've already mentioned, alles Erleben ist eine Form des Lebens. So in experience, the life process in a way comes to itself. The brain is undoubtedly necessary to integrate the organism's functions, but only within a functional fusion of brain and body. So without life, there is no consciousness and therefore no thought. We need a functional fusion of the whole system. All these vital integrative processes are biological and biochemical in nature. And as such, they can never be simulated even by highly complex computers or AI-based robots. The sensors, effectors, or digital self-models of robots represent only a mechanistic embodiment. It may superficially resemble the human body and its functions. However, without a biological body in metabolic exchange with the environment, these robots or similar systems lack the essential prerequisite for basic conscious experience. So let's go on to the second dimension. And after embodiment, enactivism can be seen as a dynamic extension of the principle of embodiment. And the central assumptions of enactivism are that cognition is based on the coupling of a living system with its environment, and the system actively co-constitutes its world rather than passively perceiving it. In other words, an organism doesn't represent, it interacts. And through this interaction, it enacts meaning. It is sense-making, as it is also called. Let us look at this more closely. It's first the coupling of organism and environment. This view traces back to Jakob von Uexküll's concept of the Umwelt. So the environment of a living being is not an independent pre-existing space. Instead, it emerges as the specific complement to the sensory motor structure and the equipment of the organism. So because of its striving for self-preservation, the organism attributes significance to certain environmental components. That's what can be described as sense-making. And in this way, the organism creates a perspective that transforms the world from a neutral place into a relevant Umwelt, into a relevant environment. So through sensory motor, sense-making, evaluating interactions, the organism shapes its own environment, and through this mutual coupling, organism and environment form a common system, or they even co-constitute each other. Then the second aspect, inactive or active cognition. So in the traditional view, a cognitive being's world is a pre-given external domain represented by the brain, as I have already pointed out several times now. But from an inactive point of view, organisms do not passively receive information, which they translate into internal representation. Rather, they actively participate in the generation of meaning. And so there's an intrinsic connection of perception and action. What the organism senses is a function of how it moves, and how it moves is a function of what it senses. So this can be illustrated by a classical sensory motor circle schema, where object and body are connected in a reciprocal feedback loop of continuous action and continuous perception. This can also be illustrated by a classical and I think ingenious experiment of Held and Hein already 60 years ago. Held and Hein investigated two groups of newborn kitten, which are blind at first, and one group was carried around in a training environment in a basket on the right side. And so these kittens only received passively visual stimuli, whereas the other group could move around on their own, actively moving in the same environment. And when released after 6 weeks, only the active kittens had acquired adequate spatial perception, whereas the other passive kittens only stumbled around helplessly, bumped against objects, were obviously unable to move in external space. So we can see spatial perception is, of course, mediated by the brain and the developing brain of the kittens. And we can conclude from that interacting with the environment induced the kittens' brains to develop precisely those structures that were necessary for the adequate perception of the environment. And this experiment shows that perceptual space is not just an external container in which we move, it is rather an extension of our own bodily space, a workspace, so to speak. And the inactive approach takes this generally. Living beings create, they enact their environment through their own interaction with it. Living beings create, enact their specific environment through their interaction with it. To illustrate this, to illustrate this once more, let us look at perception from a classical representationalist approach. Then there is an object out there, here on the right side, a pair of pliers, whose features are transmitted to the retina, then further processed by the brain using an internal representation of the object. And once this is activated, a conscious picture, image, model of the brain is created. But instead of this linear model, the enactive approach regards the object as being constituted through sensory motor cycles. And therefore, we need a fully embodied worker here and not just a brain. Perceptual experience is not an inner state of the brain, but a skillful activity achieved by the perceiver's knowledge of the object, of the way sensory stimulation varies with his movement. So in vision, for example, when the head moves or the eyes rotate, then the sensory stimulation on the retina shifts in precise ways. In touching an object, the sensory motor dependencies are even more obvious. And moreover, the objects are always perceived as enabling possible actions, affording possible actions. They are objects ready to hand, as it is obvious in the case of the pliers. And the object can only be perceived by an embodied agent that is capable of somehow interacting with it, having, for example, suitable limbs to walk towards the pliers, to grasp it, and so on. In these interactions, the brain works as a mediating, a relational organ. It provides the open loops, as one could say, neural dispositions that are only closed to full functional cycles by the complementary and fitting counterparts of the environment, in this case, the pliers. But we have acquired certain dispositions to handle the pliers. And this is already supported, this is also supported by the discovery of so-called canonical sensory motor neurons in the premotor cortex. And these neurons are activated both when we deal with tools, when we handle them, and when we only look at them. So already at the first moment the pliers are looked at, we already have a feeling of how it feels like to use them. So instead of inner maps, we are equipped with neural networks as open loops that underlie the skills of interaction. And perception already evokes these loops, which are derived from earlier sensory motor experiences. And we can generalize this and say, to know and to recognize a thing is already always to know how to deal with it, how to interact with it. Enactive cognition thus implies a primacy of activity or interaction between living beings and their environment. And instead of cognition as inner representation, we have a pragmatic criterion for meaningful cognition, namely viability. That means the feasibility of meaningful further interaction. A meaningful perception enables the next step, so to speak. That is interesting for focusing interested people. The next step, or thinking at the edge, that's also a kind of viability where we are prepared for the next, anticipating what is possible next. This is the general principle of enactivism. Now, third dimension, extendedness. In the cognitivist paradigm, cognition is considered as purely brain-based, a function that is kind of sandwiched between sensory input and motor output. And then consciousness becomes something like a movie in the head or a world model. In contrast, the extended perspective suggests that mental processes include the body and the objects in the environment as their constitutive basis. An example, for example, is the instrumental use of tools, such as in mathematical calculations. The first tool, of course, was the body itself, because we have all learned to calculate with our fingers. For complex calculations with multiple steps, we can offload them to an external medium, such as a blackboard or a notepad. And such tools become an integral part of the cognitive system. They are constitutive for the process of calculation, not mere external support. The extended embodiment can be well illustrated by the attempt to find the keys for a certain word on a computer keyboard where the letters have been removed, as you see here. You can try and find out where you find the word brain, for example. Where's the B, where's the R, where's the A? Normally you don't know it, but if you try it out, you might kind of imagine your fingers lying on the keyboard, and then you may find it because the fingers know where the words are. So where's the B, where's the R? Well, here you can control whether you had it, but you certainly didn't know it explicitly, but you used your fingers on the keyboard. Now, this is a kind of embodied memory. Where should we localize it? Well, the knowledge is literally in the hands as an embodied know-how, which is actualized in contact with the keyboard. Of course, we also the brain is required for that, especially the basal ganglia in which the movement sequences are stored. But without the hands and without the keyboard, the brain would be useless. And this means the ability is not localized in the brain, even less its exercise, of course. It is rather an emergent property of the whole system of brain, body, and keyboard, realized in an extended and enactive way. And the term body memory describes the whole body in connection with the environment as the carrier of our embodied abilities and memories. That's a term I've particularly explored, body memory or embodied memory. Now the fourth aspect, which we have already prepared, embeddedness means that cognitive processes are supported by the environment and individual objects within it. So while the extended mind concept refers to cognitive processes extending, reaching out into the environment, embedding means that cognition always occurs within a context of suitable spatial, instrumental, and culturally provided elements. And this context can influence and support cognition in various ways. Think of a bartender who arranges the different components of his cocktails behind the bar to make the mixing process as efficient as possible. Another example may be street signs that we use collectively. There's also the role of cultural environment, which is illustrated by this. The suitable objects in our everyday surroundings are predominantly cultural creations, and humans create their own ecological niche in the broadest sense. And this is achieved through tools, buildings, roads, as well as through cognitive structures like writing, books, calendars, computers. All this serves as external information carriers or memories, and language itself may ultimately be regarded as the most important cognitive structure that humanity has developed, and which every child acquires in early socialization. So ecological niche, embeddedness, rounds up the picture of the embodied mind. And now we can have a look at the embedded brain and see how these processes influence the development of the brain. How does the appropriation occur? How does the cognitive system change during processes of embodiment and learning? Now, these processes imply a continuous restructuring and adaptation of the brain, which means that the development of suitable neural networks is induced by the interaction. And the crucial term here is, of course, neuroplasticity, which means that the history of interactions continuously influences the brain and its structure, and thus a person's dispositions and skills. We can illustrate this by the scheme here. Experience, behavior, and such the living process in which our lived body, our life, is included, induces, without our intention, without our will, just by itself, processes of plastic change of the brain. So the körper, the body, the object body, changes its structure in every interaction. And this already modifies future experience or future behavior. So we have a constant feedback loop between experience and process on the one hand, and structure on the other hand. And this sedimentation leads over time to our habits, our skills, the interactive schemes that enable us to deal with a pair of pliers, but also with other people, the dispositions that are part of body memory. Remember also the embodied memory of the keyboard, which you use when typewriting. It has been developed and formed in the process of continuous experience and the resulting structure in your brain. An impressive example of this top-down structuring is found in an experiment of the neuroscientist Miranka Sur and others. They were able to induce a major cortical reorganization in newborn ferrets, which are also blind at first. And Sur and his group now, it's a quite brutal experiment, sorry, they cut through one of the optical nerves of the ferrets, connected it with the auditory pathway to the cortex, and afterwards the ferrets again could move around freely. And now visual stimuli, independence on their motor activity, reached a quite different brain region, a region which normally processes acoustic signals. But surprisingly, through the visual motor stimulation, the acoustic brain center gradually turned into a visual center. And the ferrets were finally able to see with the affected eye normally. So we can put this in the formula: form follows function. Interacting with the environment induces the brain, or generally induces the brain, to develop the structures necessary for its adequate perception. And this means that interaction creates the corresponding brain structures. This was already recognized long before the age of neuroscience by the already mentioned philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach, in this case relating or referring to the processes of learning how to think, and not how to see. But also here, it is only through thinking that the brain is formed as an organ of thought and adapted to thinking. It is modified and determined through the habit of thinking this or that one way or another. But only through the fully shaped organ of thought, thinking itself becomes educated, skilled, secure. So what was effect becomes cause, and vice versa. So we see, even without any knowledge of the exact mechanisms, Feuerbach was already able to see and to understand the spiral or the circular structure of process and plasticity that enables our processes of learning. So, of course, here the social environment, when we learn thinking, is the crucial ecological niche for the infant's brain development. The embodied mind is intersubjectively formed from birth on. To summarize, I've outlined the main tenets of 4E cognition: embodied, inactive, extended, embedded. And I've also described the major circles in which the brain is embedded, inserted, and which are crucial for human cognition. And these are first the circles of organismic self-regulation, resulting, as we have seen, in a basic sense of self, a feeling of being alive, basic background feeling of the body. Then there are circles of sensorimotor coupling between organism and environment, resulting in what may be called the extended mind. And there are cycles of intersubjective interaction, resulting in the skills that we have acquired in the course of our socialization. And the human brain is, of course, crucial for closing these circles through its functions, through its open loops. But it doesn't create the cycles, but it mediates and regulates them. And it is in turn continuously shaped and structured by them throughout the lifespan. And if we look at consciousness once more, the brain is certainly necessary for the emergence of consciousness, because all circular processes that I've outlined are converging in it. But conscious activity is not localized within the brain. Rather, it is the integral of the actual relations between the brain, the organism, and the environment, the ecological integral, one could say. So if neural processes function as carrier of mental processes, they do so only as part of overarching life processes that include the living being, the human being as a whole. Or in short, consciousness is not somewhere within us. Consciousness is being in the world.